Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
I hope that you're having a great day, and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
And I'm Chris Province.
And I'm Hannah Bratterud. All right, so we've been exploring intentional leadership this entire season, and we've been looking at different aspects of intentional leadership each month. We have a different topic that we dive into, and we've created some resources for you to help guide you along. And if you want to dive deeper with us into these topics, go to magicintheroom.com and download the free guide, reflection guide for this month's topic. And Chris, you want to introduce this month's topic?
Yeah, and this month we're going to talk about values and kind of how they shape our ability to notice, choose, and act on what's important. And there's a lot to excavate on this, and I think there's a lot about value identification that requires a little bit of that digging. So let's just kick it off and let's talk about values more globally. When we say values, I think it's easy to lump it into, I'm going to say the word, and then you process the word and understand it as you see fit. But I think it's important to understand that value, there's more than one type of value. Mm-hmm. And if we can understand kind of the tenets of values, then we can maybe shape or put words to what we value a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah. I just want to provide some quick context to why we're talking about value in this framework of intentional leadership. As you know, a couple months ago, we introduced this concept of the iceberg model, that there's this this metaphor of an iceberg where only about 10 or 15% of us show up below the surface. It's the observable things that we notice, or the observable actions and behaviors that we take that others can see or that we're consciously aware of. And below the surface are all these different constructs that impact what you see on the surface. And values is one of those things. If we're not explicitly aware of our values and the values of the people around us, it can cause some challenges. So this is just another scuba dive down below the surface to look at one other aspect of what drives our behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the whole idea is helpful because if we want to shape what happens above the surface, where we influence people, where people can see our decisions, we really have to know what's underneath driving it. And mm-hmm. Chris, to your point about values being not very well defined and something that people talk about a lot, but it's like, well, I don't really know what that is. I think that's one of the reasons that it's hard when we dive under the surface and look at those things down in the unseen parts of that iceberg that, drives our life and the choices that show up above the surface. It's like, well, what am I even looking for? What is a value? I don't know what I'm even looking at if I go down into that murky darkness. What is a value? Mm-hmm. So I'm excited to dig into that as well and provide some level of clarity there, because if we're going to define our personal values, we got to know what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think about a value, and my recent thinking on values was shaped by a HBR article that talked about the difference between values and beliefs. So a value is, we'd like to think of it as something that we care deeply about, something that's core to who we are. And it tends to be pretty stable. A value is not something that we're going to change every month or every year. They tend to be kind of guidelines for us, for our behaviors, for our decisions. Sometimes we draw on our values and we're not aware of it. Sometimes we're explicit about it and we're fully aware of behaving according to our values. So value is, you can think of as a goal, whereas a belief is a means to the end, a means to reach that goal. And our beliefs can change. We change our beliefs about how to achieve this goal, this value that we hold dear, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the end, whereas the belief is the means to that end.
Well, I think a great example of that, just to kind of make it a little bit easier to wrap our minds around, is, the value of fairness or justice. And a lot of people have that core value that they want things to be fair. I would say most of us. That's a value that drives our choices and our pursuits in life. Now, there are different beliefs that shape how that value shows up for people.
Yeah.
So I know for me, I've always really cared about fairness and justice, but it wasn't until I married someone, a person of color, and had kids who are, Native American tribal citizens, and some of them who look darker, that I started actually myself examining my beliefs and changing my beliefs about what's fair. And so like having a child that I want to be treated fairly through life causes me to like change a little bit about my beliefs about what do I really think is fair? And how do I apply that value? So the belief might change, but that value remains the same around fairness. When it was just me, I was mostly concerned about what's fair for me. And I would get mad if something didn't feel like, oh, I missed that opportunity. Someone else got the opportunity. That's not fair to me, right? But my beliefs about fairness and how we think about fairness have changed. So I hope that helps to just give a little bit more of a practical value of fairness is the same. Beliefs as a means to how we execute or achieve those values, can shift and adjust over time. And probably mine will continue to shift and adjust over time.
So in that way, I think values can be, like what I value can be directional. It can point me a certain way or maybe light a path for me to follow. Values can help me be steadfast in the face of adversity and determine what am I willing to fight for. They could also be excellent decision filters for what am I willing to sacrifice to experience something that I value. So while they have different values play a number of roles in determining what our outcomes are, I don't think there's any doubt that they're important.
Yeah.
So if you guys wouldn't mind, unpack this notion for me of there's different value types. I think there's societal values, there's some unique values. Like, what are the types of values that exist that we're actually dealing with?
Yeah. So this is where it really gets practical for an individual leader who's trying to be more intentional. Because, in my example earlier about valuing fairness or justice is something that most of us as a society, we value. We've created criminal justice system. We've created all of these laws about property ownership and whatever else. And those are based on some shared values about what is fair, what is just. We want that to happen, right? There are other values that our culture shares for the most part, right? And, we could brainstorm some of those here, but I think where it gets really powerful for us as leaders is if we go beyond the shared values, like fairness, like the chance for self-determination. Most people want a chance to determine their own future and have personal choice, right? As long as it doesn't impact other people. Those are like shared, societal values. But for me, like, yeah, great. Most of us have those. And if we don't have them and we offend them, someone's hopefully going to hold you accountable and you'll be in jail or whatever. But for me, directing my own life and my own effort, I have to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, yes, I hold for the most part the same societal or shared values as most of my neighbors do. But there are some things that I value that are unique. and are probably like just me and just mine. And so, I mean, I actually have written them down and kind of done the work to figure them out. So for me, my 4 core values are courage, adventure, learning, and beauty. And those are a little bit more specific to me because I don't think the majority of the population has this exact same mix of things that they value. And, I'll just give a little bit of an explainer. So I'll just choose one here, like courage. Moving away from the status quo begins with the courage of individuals. I want to lean into new and better ways of living and invite others to follow. So that's how I describe this core value of courage. And you can see in that or hear in that as I read that a little bit about what courage means to me. It's about change. It's about leaning into change. It's about being a model of being fearless and letting go of old things quickly. And I think that's just kind of part of my personality and experiences, the things under the surface, our personality, our experiences. This is one of those things that's just unique to me. But if I don't know that, and I don't do the work to identify what's unique to me, then I just kind of default to all the shared societal values, and it becomes much less helpful in setting direction and goal setting and deciding where I'm going to give my energy.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to think about that in terms of creating alignment and creating shared, so recognizing that we all have unique values, but we also have shared values when we need to create common ground with another person within a team, right? So, Chris, what you were alluding to is research by Shalom Schwartz, the theory of basic values. And that theory outlines 3 different types of values, right? There are survival values that we could say every human being values, things like food, shelter, clothing, safety, right? We value those things as what keeps us alive. Then there's societal values that help us live together in society and build society. And one of the reasons human beings have been successful as a species is because we have these shared societal values. And again, these are things that most other human beings will value: honesty, connection, friendship, respect, family. Now, how those values play out and our beliefs about how to achieve those values might be very different from individual to individual, right? But when we need to create common ground, I think leaning into some of these societal values is helpful. When we need to create differentiation and when we need to lean into unique, we've talked about strengths already on this podcast, right? The things that make us unique, in order to be really intentional about our performance, I think it becomes really helpful to become aware of what are our individual, personal, unique values, and also for organizations, what are the unique core values for this organization, right? That are not just kind of generic things that everybody says they value. There are the specific things that make this organization unique, and we call those unique values. Those are the things that Luke just mentioned, and the other examples of that could be learning, innovation, right? Different types of unique values.
And this is why we get really, I'm not going to say critical, but this is why we encourage leaders to rethink their values if they have things like integrity up on the wall as one of their values. We're like, okay, well, welcome to society. Like, our society values integrity. And if people don't act with integrity, like they're outside the norm.
It's a little bit of a table stakes,
Right.
Like, duh.
Yeah. So it's not unique and specific enough to actually direct activity, to actually direct decision-making. And so we instead say things like, okay, one of our clients, they said grit was a core value. I was like, that's a beautiful core value because it's different enough from integrity and, fairness and some of the things that we mentioned that it's like, okay, it means we do these things. Here are some behaviors we commit to because we value grit. When the stakes get hard, when a deadline's approaching, we do what it takes to execute on it, even if it means we work a little bit differently than our competitors or other organizations. So yeah,
Well, and I think what I think is mission critical there's the word to describe the value, but then there's always the commitment or interpretation of it. So when we go as far as to identify the value as a commitment, it clarifies or makes explicit the standard or expectation for myself, or in an organizational context for the organization. But so if I say I value performance, everyone will have a different interpretation of that. But when I say becoming better is a moral imperative,
Yeah.
we're not going to let perfect be the enemy of better. Every day we get better. And that's a standard for me or for an organization or whatever that might be. But carrying that through, and I've kind of walked through the balance of, Luke and I have a shared value of courage, but how I get into mine is like just being comfortable with what is uncomfortable, like leaning into what is not comfortable. Getting to kindness and that idea of like extending grace to everyone because of their experiences and their personality and their own values. They come by who they are honestly and their response to stimulus honestly, and not discounting that, but giving grace. Now, if I say grace is a value, we're going to all interpret that 100 different ways.
Yeah.
But when I share, extend grace to everyone, because they are who they are honestly, we have an understanding of what I mean when speaking to grace. And then lastly, this value of love, which is just nothing more than making certain the people that I love know that.
Yeah.
And
I think that's when we make commitments behavioral, it becomes really clear, right? It gives us that common shared language and understanding for how this value comes alive and how we achieve this value, how we as a team, as an organization, agree to achieve this value. So it doesn't just become a word in a PowerPoint presentation from some retreat a few years ago and nothing ever, there wasn't congruence in how that value was lived. And so making it that explicit of these are the things we commit to in order to make this value true, that's a really powerful kind of next level of leadership.
Well, and I know, Hannah, you've been taking a lot of teams through this exercise lately. So what is the process that you found really helpful in taking a lot of individual leaders through this journey?
Yeah, and again, I was inspired to do this, and I'll find the exact reference to the article in HBR, so we can list it in the show notes if others are interested in reading about it. But what really struck me was the idea. So we talk about, okay, we got to make the values real. We got to talk about them. We got to, and there's this kind of misnomer that if we say our corporate values over and over and over again, they will become true and they will become the values of the people who work in our organization. And because of what we talked about earlier, that values are stable, we tend to not change our values. So just because my organization says that they value X doesn't mean that I value X. And we kind of have this expectation that people are going to, if they're going to work in our organization, they have to change their values to align with ours. It doesn't really work that way.
Can. It absolutely can.
So what is true is that when someone's personal values do not align with the values of the organization, it creates friction.
Right.
One of the biggest sources of human conflict and team conflict is misalignment on values.
Right. So in our nerdery, right, it's the idea of value congruence,
Yeah.
right, or incongruence.
Yeah.
To what degree someone is congruent determines their ability to engage and perform.
Right. And so the exercise that's been really helpful is to reverse the order. Instead of saying, these are our corporate values, now you adopt them, we ask, what are your personal values? what are the personal values of our team members? And we surface what those are, because what's important is that we care about the same things. When we don't care about the same things, there's value incongruence.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we want to retain the people that we really value in our organization, it would be helpful for us to know what they value so that we can align our corporate values with the personal values of the people in our organization. Now, we also have to look at what serves our strategy, right? So when we surface, so the exercise that we've been taking teams through is we actually ask the team members, what are your personal values? We surface what values rise to the top. We, as a leadership team, look at that and say, okay, this is what the people, our team members say that they really care about. What aligns with our strategy? What helps to advance our purpose as an organization? And maybe it's time to update our corporate values to align with those two things, our team member values and our purpose.
I'm absolutely triggered right now. Because if organizationally, one, I think what you're speaking of discounts senior leader intent, and it discounts ownership intent to a degree by saying we will manipulate our corporate values based on individual responses. I think, I don't know if I believe, but I think if we are clear and explicit about what we value organizationally, we can avoid bringing on people that are misaligned.
100%.
That create that friction.
100%.
So rather than flip the script, like having the corporate values anchored is important to creating a system of shared belief.
Yes, and when we're at a point in an organization when it's clear that either we don't have clear corporate values or it's time to review them, what's more powerful than to say, these are our team members that we value?
Do we?
Well, that's the first question. If we don't value our team members, then why are they there?
Well, in most low-performing organizations that I have been in, like we're not even thinking about this. Like we're just doing. Everybody's doing stuff. There's no assumption that anyone is valued because everyone's just kind of trying to survive.
Yeah, and I think, don't hear here that we're discounting senior leader intent, right? The assumption is that senior leader intent is clear and that we have a base of people that actually align with that. Now, if we don't, that's a whole nother organizational conundrum that we have to solve, right? But if we have attracted employees, team members that we want to retain, and we're not clear on what our values are, and we've not been intentional in how we chose those values and what values we chose, that's where this exercise becomes really, really helpful to crystallize that, right? Yes, these senior leaders are part of that exercise of saying, these are things we really care about. These are our non-negotiables. And we know that one of the four precursors to engagement is not only value congruence, that's one of them. Another one is organizational participation, right? Having a voice in the decisions that impact us. So if we as an organization are going to update, review, clarify our values, let's get some input of what is it that this organization actually values based on the people that are part of it.
I think what we're talking about here, we're getting into the art of organization development, because Chris, what I hear you saying is like our purpose and the senior leaders who are responsible for stewarding that purpose should drive everything that we do organizationally. And I agree with that. And Hannah, I hear you saying we have to understand the values of our team members. And if we include them in the development of core values, there's a win there because their buy-in is higher and they get to say, oh, what I care about is now what the organization says it cares about. that's great. I'm more excited to be here. I think the reality is somewhere in between where, and this is going to be hard for people to replicate because this is what we do for a living, is like we do the jujitsu in between to take both of these things that are true and create language that works both ways, that advances the organization, the strategy, the shared purpose, and builds higher levels of engagement. So we kind of went off on this tangent of organization design, management consulting, like the work that we do. But I think for individuals, the takeaway from this is that there is an art to identifying your values. So when Chris shared out earlier, the behaviors that align with his value of courage, I mean, I can read my bullet points for courage and they're different. For mine, it's, what does courage mean? It means I'm committed to addressing the heart of the matter. I'm committed to caring enough for others to speak up the important things, even when it's hard. I'm committed for fighting for people who don't have the power to fight for themselves. And I'm committed to, as quickly as possible, letting go of old sources of security rather than letting, the desire for security hold me back. So my interpretation of courage, totally valid. Chris's interpretation of courage, totally valid. But for us as individual leaders, like the fact that we did the work and came up with the word, like that's the win. Because now we each have these lists of behaviors, and if we don't do them, we know that we didn't do them. If I hold on to something that's providing me revenue because I'm scared of what's going to happen if I let go of that revenue, that's not me acting in a way that's aligned with courage.
Yeah.
Right. And if I don't have that written down, it's really hard to know. So I want to go back and close the gap on the organizational value conversation. Like we as leaders have to, whatever we land on, right, get clear enough that people can both buy in, but be held accountable.
Yeah. And I think this process works in a few different ways, right? So we're big believers in collecting data, collecting information, actually asking the organization and individual team members for input around culture, around leadership practices. If we ask for input around values, what better test to see if we do have the people in our organization that actually align with our values? If we've been intentional and explicit about what we say that we value in our organization, and we ask our team members for their input, and there's clear misalignment there, that's a huge red flag. And that's a data point that's helpful.
Well, and that's why effective leadership development programs are going to ask every individual to go through the process of identifying their values and then test those against those of the organization. And I think that's really like you have to have both.
Yes.
You have to have explicit organizational values and the leaders, and which all people are leaders, right, or have the ability to notice, choose, and act. The people within the organization have to be developed in such a way to know where they stand so that we don't have conflict. Yeah. Because if there's this evaluation that every team member is doing every day that says, is this organization worthy of my effort? And if those values are not defined by the organization, there is no way for a fair evaluation to be made.
Yeah.
Now, when they are explicit and the organization or a supervisor violates those values, then team members are energized to behave in deviant ways or go exit bound or disengage. But the only way, I think, to set up the evaluation that every team member makes every day about the organization's worthiness is to make the values explicit. And I want to ask, like, I think a lot of times you see words on a wall.
Yeah.
Which I love this language. It comes from Dr. Jeff Simmons at Oklahoma Christian. And we were talking about this issue of like so many times values are just words on the wall. And he would say, well, that has to do with intensity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no value intensity. There's no moral intensity applied to the values of the organization. So there's no assumption that they would become adopted or integrated or part of actually what's going on. Yeah. I'm interested, like from you guys, like what are the things that drive the intensity of the values once they're identified?
Well, it's just like anything else. It's like our commitment to the thing. And so step 1, do the work, reflect, identify your values, write it down. That in itself, step 1, identifying and documenting our values, that's a level of intentionality that gets us further than we are if we haven't identified our values. And that goes for organizations or individuals. The second step is put into place accountability measures. Accountability measures could be as simple as I print out my core values and the behaviors that align with those, and I hang them next to my desk. Or I email them to my wife. Because what I'm doing with that accountability measure of just sharing what my values are is I'm giving people the opportunity to say, is this someone who aligns with their values, behaves in alignment with their values or not? I'll go back to the iceberg thing. They say under the surface, this is the thing that drives them. That's down there in their unseen, parts of the iceberg driving what you can see above the surface. But when I look above the surface, I see something that is not in alignment with the words that I was told. So just sharing it provides some level of accountability. It provides even for ourselves, right? If I look at it, I can evaluate, am I living up to these values or not? And I don't want to discount the fact that all of us as individuals, our day-to-day behavior does not align 100% with our values. Like, that's real. We should all know that. Like, just think for 10 seconds. When's the last time you did something that didn't align with what you believe and what your values are? Probably hasn't even been very many days since it happened, right? We all act in ways that aren't aligned with our values. But if we don't identify granularly, what are my values? What are my expectations? It's more difficult for us to hold ourselves accountable to our vision. Okay, now for an organization, all of that is true. But the accountability measures that are put in place might be more like skip level meetings, 360s, changing our performance management program so that we're actually talking about the values and coaching conversations, doing a anonymous survey once a month to say, are we aligned with our values or not, or what's going well, what's not going well, right? Some sort of thing that provides accountability and is a mechanism so that we can evaluate how aligned are we with our values. Because the reality is for every organization, like, they do things that aren't aligned with their values, just like we do as individuals. And the journey of aligning our behaviors and decisions with our values, like, that's a journey every organization should be on as well.
Well, and recognition plays a role.
Yeah.
Right. Do we So metaphor, like, I need two things as an organizational leader. I need a shovel and a spotlight. I'm going to use the spotlight to shine the light on every team member that advances our values. Where do I see those values in action? They get the spotlight. For team members that violate our values or tackle other team members or hold us back, work against the goals of the organization, I'm going to excavate them, right? And this shovel looks like corrective action, progressive discipline, coaching, right? Whatever it takes to get that behavior out of the organization so we can get on with the business of activating that greatest good. That's what it takes. So I think as organizational leaders, you got to have those two things. Do I have a proper spotlight from a recognition standpoint? And do I have a proper shovel in order to create the right climate for performance to happen?
Yeah.
So, Hannah, tell me, how do values influence how we notice, choose, and act?
Great question. So if we go back to this idea that values are something we care deeply about, that's core to who we are, and they are kind of that end that we're striving for, some kind of outcome, a goal. It is fundamental to driving behavior, right? Because, and whether we're explicit or not about our values, and again, we're talking about intentional leadership here, so we're making the assumption that we're going to be intentional about what we value. But doing that personal exploration first right? Recognizing, okay, I notice so let's take Luke's example of fairness. I notice when things are not fair because this is a really important value for me. And it's a trigger for me when things are not fair. Or I choose to align my behavior in ways that I can create the most amount of fairness for people, right? So that value of fairness really impacts what we notice, what in Luke's case, what he notices, the choices that he makes and the actions that he takes, right? And, if we take his more personal value of adventure, right? I'm just picking on you, Luke. But I happen to share that value of adventure, right? What we believe about how to achieve adventure might differ, right?
Yeah.
But we're going to notice things that are adventurous or that look like adventure, and we're going to interpret adventure in a positive light versus a negative light. And it's going to impact what choices we take and what actions we make and what decisions we make.
It might influence compensation. It might influence benefits. It might influence, again, recognition, offboarding, orientation. I mean, kind of all the way through.
Yeah.
I also want to call out that as a senior leader, just because I don't value it personally doesn't mean we shouldn't value it organizationally.
Yeah.
So, and I think about both of you would look at liabilities different than I would. Like I would look at, aggressive, offensive sort of things. Like I'm not good at defense, but you all can identify and say, well, what about this blind spot of the exposure that's created when we X? Okay. So you're valuing exposure will influence our organizational values, even if I don't see it. So I think that's a bit of a critical component here.
Well, there's some hair splitting there too that I think is important for people listening, because yes, do we engage with places that don't 100% align to our values, like our core unique values? Sure. All the time, right? When I buy Amazon Prime, there's a value proposition there. It doesn't mean they have to value the 4 things that I read out earlier, right? For me to align it in some way and buy the product or be engaged there, or even with an employer. As long as, this is the thing that I want to talk about, there, you don't get to this tipping point of moral injury. So there's been a lot of new research, the last few years about the principle of moral injury. And it basically means when I'm asked to do something that is in conflict with my core values, I experience a dissonance between the behavior of the organization that I'm with, their values, what they ask me to do, and what I personally value. And when there's direct conflict, it creates moral injury, which is very closely related to, emotional labor. So I have to do more labor managing that injury. Like I have to think about it. I have to think about, like, what am I going to do here? I'm in this dilemma. Like all of that, we should avoid as much as possible. So do we align with people that don't 100% share our unique values? Yes, we can engage with them. We can work alongside them. But when it comes to moral injury and values that really are in opposition, like we want to avoid those scenarios if at all possible.
Yeah, but I would say, what's the thing when it gets to the point of ostracization, isolation because of differences? They understand, like that's when we start supercharging or energizing deviant behavior, exit-bound behavior. Why do people lie, cheat, and steal? It's because they're isolated, or they see someone lying, cheating, or stealing. Understand, like if my supervisor cheats and it's permitted, then there's no such thing as cheating anymore. So I might be energized to follow the same behavior, and it's a norm at that point. It's it's a value.
Yeah.
Or if our values are so divergent that I see you as the bad guy, it's a lot shorter step for me to cheat you than people that I view as the good guy.
Robin Hood, right?
Yeah.
You get that whole idea. So I'm going to put Hannah on the spot and say, okay, we have an employee that fits a little bit of the mold that Luke's just describing. And you can kind of see the demands of the organization are putting this employee, someone that's on your team, in a position where they feel morally injured. And maybe they're starting to shut down. Maybe they're starting to vocalize discontent with the company. Like, what do you do as the people leader for that person? How do you navigate that space?
Yeah.
Because there is going to be times when organizational values and organizational demands are going to be in conflict with personal ethics or values.
Yeah. And that's why making values explicit is so important, and behavioralizing them and committing to, as a community, as universally within this organization, we commit to these kinds of behaviors because it's what we believe. So it should become pretty clear, right, when there's misalignment. And so you asked, what would I do as a people leader? I think I would first ask some questions of, okay, why is this happening? Why is there misalignment here? Or why is this person acting out or disengaging, right? Because it can show up in two different ways. Either you shut down and completely disengage, or you start to take disruptive action. And so does it mean that, so are we clear on what our values and commitments are as an organization? Do we have supervisors or people leaders who are violating that? And is that what the individual team member is feeling and experiencing? Or do we have a case of, here's an individual team member who clearly doesn't align with the things that we've said we value. They value other things. Well, that's a really energy costly experience, for that team member to show up and try to be someone they're not and try to fit in with values that they don't actually care about or align with. That's stressful for that individual, and it causes friction, and it's really difficult to be the leader in that. And that's when we, having the conversation of, maybe this isn't a good fit, right, is clear. But when there's clear violation of the corporate values that we've agreed to in the commitments, getting to the source of that and having the conversation about, why is this happening? And let's talk about it, because we said we commit to these things. And if we have, individual leaders who are not aligning with that and causing moral injury for their team members, that's a huge leadership challenge. Yeah.
And sometimes that's more of like the entity and what it's doing. And sometimes that's the direct supervisor making an ask of a team member that causes that injury. But
can we dig into an example? Because I think there's a lot of gray in between both of those things that you mentioned, either the organization participating in unethical decision-making or an employee perceived,
right?
Or an employee who you perceive that their values don't align with you. So I'm going to give this example. It's pretty low stakes, but I've been, the last 4 or 5 organizations I've been involved with, it's always a conversation. Hey, we have all these email addresses, put them on the newsletter list. And the social media person is always like, but the ICANN spam laws say I can't do that unless someone opts in. And the organization says, well, everyone else in the world does it. How are we supposed to compete with everyone else in the world who just takes any email address they get and put it on their newsletter list? As long as we're not getting blacklisted by getting marked as spam by too many recipients, push the limits. The social media person says, I'm not comfortable with that. So tell me, like, how do you navigate that? Because that's moral injury. That's an example of moral injury.
Well, you're not going to have your social media person for very long, right? Because you're forcing them into like surface acting, like generally aligned with who I am organically, just little turn of the screw, make it happen. But when you go to this level, like you have someone saying, I want to follow the letter of the law because I understand the law to be my moral guideline.
Yeah.
I value the law. And the organization, like basically the upper decision, says, we're going to add these to the list. Basically, either you can do it or we will find another way to get them on there. And like that is the point of injury. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a lot of gray area in that one. But what I would say, like introducing a spot where there's gray area is...
Let's finish this one because
Okay.
I do think there's gray area. And I think the principle here is like where I've seen it handled well was through negotiation. Like it wasn't through discounting that team member's perspective. And I'm saying this from the side of someone who leans more towards throw the email addresses on the list. Like, so I'll put that out there. I've pressured.
And I come from the other side,
Right.
which
I've
is like
pressured,
keep them off.
Yeah.
Right?
I've pressured people to do that who weren't comfortable with it. Now, pressured is probably the wrong word because I think where it's worked well, there's been real collaboration and how can we be creative about this and what would you be comfortable with? What I want to encourage people with is like avoid at all costs the words, just do it.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you, but just do it. Okay, we've talked, I took your concerns to the senior leadership team. We talked about it. We decided that you need to just do it. Like if we can take just do it out of our vocabularies as leaders, I think it helps us in the long term.
Or considering, like we talked about last month, like what is the range of possible decisions? Can we go ask for an opt-in? Is there a conditional yes between the two parties?
Right.
Right. And so here's the question I wanted to get to when we're speaking to moral injury, like what is the value or is it valuable in calling back? Because I might be violating your value of justice, but is there value in calling back to our purpose or the greatest good and saying like, do you believe this is the greatest good we can accomplish in like getting it out of the weeds of a particular decision that violates a down level value and going back to the thing we're all trying, we have violent agreement about our greatest good. What's the value in that?
Yeah. High, super high.
Yeah.
So maybe if we find ourselves in those situations, I like the idea of like, well, why does the conflict exist?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still have violent agreement about our greatest good? Mm-hmm. And then to your point, Luke, find the conditional yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think as individuals, we can do the same thing. Like if we're the ones who are being asked to do something that we're not 100% comfortable with or that doesn't align with the value of ours, we can lead up in those situations as well and say, here's what I understand to be our shared purpose, our highest possible good. And I see that you're asking me to do this thing to get us there, but I think if we agree that's the highest possible good, I have an alternate route to get us there. And so anyone can call out the purpose. And I'd say the more we call it out and the more clear I am on my values, if I can say, here are my personal core values, here's why I'm not comfortable doing it, that's only helpful.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to dive a little deeper in a subsequent episode around kind of the universal, there are some universal human values and you can group values, right? So kind of back to our debate a little earlier, is it, do we take input on values or do we dictate values or set direction for values? It's a little bit both and. What's helpful is to understand how a value construct, like how values group together, right? I may say tomato, you may say tomato. We mean the same thing, but we use different words and different expressions of it. And back to your example of, well, if this organization doesn't have beauty or courage on their wall as values. Oh, I can't work there. Well, sure. Yes. Let's look at what we actually mean by those things, right?
Yeah.
So,
And I think going back to that conversation, I think it is 100% brand dependent. It depends on the brand, whether it is founder centric, senior leader centric, and driven from a leverage point of the enterprise, or if it's groundswell, I think more like triple bottom line companies, where it would come from the masses, from the people doing the work, and really kind of raise from the team members into the market. So 100%, I think that's the point of the conversation, is it's the art of understanding the circumstance and the environment in which that enterprise operates in, which we are comfortable with, but it's hard to witch that water.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So as we sing our way out today, I think a lot of great conversation. Let's get our key takeaways in.
Yeah. So for me, great reminder of my values. I love any excuse to pull them out because it's holding myself accountable. And for me, that's what values are about. They're about accountability, in closing the gap between what we believe and what we actually do. And so I think, for listeners, that would be the takeaway that I would want people to have the most, is the more specific I get about my values, the more I can hold myself accountable to notice where what's happening is not aligned with my values, make a conscious choice to move toward closing that gap between what's happening and what I believe, and then be courageous to act on it. So, that's my takeaway. Values are about accountability. They're about getting where we want to be in life and aligning what we do and what we say we believe.
Yeah. And my takeaway is I'm leveraging the organizational values to create a moral climate for every team member that exists within this space. And that climate should create the intention for all of the behaviors that ultimately create our culture and determine the quality of the service or product that we bring to market. I also have to embrace, as an enterprise leader, that every single day, every moment of every day, me as a leader and our organization are being evaluated on our character by every team member and every customer. If we align, if we clear that evaluation, team members sacrifice and we get to charge a premium for our product. If we fail to pass that evaluation, if our behavior does not align with our values and we are perceived to be low character, if we fail that evaluation by every team member and every customer every day, we will pay a premium for team members and we will discount our product.
Yeah.
And that's the takeaway. And I think that's the core of what values mean to brands, organizations, and enterprise.
Yeah. Can I just give a quick example of that? Because I think it's timely. So one way to think about that is the value destruction of Tesla over the last several months. And essentially, as Elon's core values become more and more evident now that he's the owner of Twitter, and just like over and over, like in the news cycle, his values just become more and more crystallized, directly affected the price that they were able to charge for a Tesla. And now you see Tesla discounts all over the place. So being clear about our values and then aligning with them, it's real.
Yeah.
Right? It has real outcomes, and people do evaluate us every day based on our values.
Well, and that was exactly my takeaway, is that push and pull of value alignment. How do you create value alignment? What are the inputs that go into clarifying values and getting explicit about values? And how do you create congruence and alignment of values? And what are the consequences when there's not that alignment? So great conversation, great episode. We created a specific reflection guide for this episode and this topic that we're going to be exploring the rest of this month.
And it helps you identify your values.
Yeah.
Like if you haven't done this exercise, the download walks you through a process to help you identify what your unique values are.
Yeah. So make sure you go to magicintheroom.com and download this episode's conversation and reflection guide. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram. Remember, if something stood out to you, resonated with you in this episode, leave us a review and share the episode out
Drop
to
us
your
that
network.
5-star.
Someone's being explicit about values here.
5 stars only.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Luke Freeman, and Hannah Braderud. It is produced by Ben West with social media support from Emma Holland and Michael Manfredi. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. Find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded on site in Big Sky, Montana. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.